I suspect most of you in the room know John already. He's been the VHF manager of the RSGB for 10 years now?
11.
11? Well, I'm sorry, John. Pedant as ever. And he's probably one of the only, if not the only person who has operated EME on 2 meters from inside Ofcom's offices in London. When we did a demo to Ofcom, and they could not understand how John was managing to make contacts via the moon while sitting in their office. So very well known to Ofcom for all sorts of reasons. And very well known to me. He lives about half a mile line of sight from my house. So I'm delighted that John operates a remote station which is about 15 miles away. But the fact that he operates that remote station means he does understand the software, he does understand how to manage these sorts of things, and that's what today's talk is going to be about in terms of software and websites that will help you as you're all going to become as much an operator working the DX that John has. John, over to you.
Right, thank you, Graham. Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you that don't know me, I thought of having 50 years of a slave to 144 meg DXing, but perhaps I've just been at it for a long time. I cover most modes. I operate CW as well as SSB, as well as digital modes. Currently, I only have 165 DXCC countries on 2 meters and just over 1,000 squares. So, but for people who would suggest you've done it, no. There's over 200 DXCCs that have been activated on 2 meters, and there are certainly more than 1,500 squares active. For those who don't regard 2 meters as a band for real DXing, I just have a couple of examples. The first one was QSO with RI1F, which is on Victoria Island in Franz Josef Land. They're only active for about 4 hours on 2 meter EME before they ran out of ammunition to shoot at the polar bears. So that was a bit of a hairy affair, and I got a phone call at 2 a.m. in the morning, and I worked them at about 6 a.m., so just scraped in. The other one is people do de-expeditions on 2 meters to the most strange places. Cook Island is quite rare on HF, not unknown, but certainly very rare on 2 meters and quite hard to work because the guy had quite low power. Anyway, aside from that, talk today is really about software that you download and online tools. I'll talk about stuff about your site, station software, antennas, because antennas is the most important part of your station, news and chat and abuse, propagation aids. There are lots of websites that suggest they could do propagations. I'll talk about some of them and the interpretation. Reporting sites and that, and at the end I'll talk a little bit about EME tools. But in general, online tools exist to help predict most modes of propagation. First and foremost is you've got to work out what you can possibly work and what sort of takeoff angle you have. My favorite site profiler is called heywhatsthat.com, and if you actually have a look, there is my QTH, or my station's QTH, so that obviously quite close to the North Sea coast. But it's quite important to have a look at what your takeoff angle is. So if I take 280 degrees there, which is inland into G, by the time I've gone about 14 or 15 kilometers, the ground is at the same height as my antenna, so that I don't have a super low takeoff angle and I rely on tropospheric bending to work further than that, really. However, if you point round at 100 degrees to the east, with a mast about 16 or 18 metres above ground, the profile is clear all the way to the North Sea at about 9 kilometres away. So the takeoff over the North Sea is absolutely superb. Now, this tool you can apply to other people, so that if you know somebody is doing a de-expedition and they're going to be working meteor scatter from X, Y, Z, it's worth having a look at the profile to have a look at the takeoff angle that they have. Because if they have a poor takeoff angle, your probability of working them is quite low. And believe it or not, I had a long argument. My view is that the one at the east-facing beach on Gibraltar is better than the top of the rock. And the reason being is that you actually get a clearer run for an offset path somewhere off the coast of Spain rather than being cluttered all the way. So it's also understanding why you can't work some people on meteor scatter and why you don't hear them via ionospheric modes. They may well just be blocked and have clutter up to 5 degrees of elevation. Simply put, I'm not going to talk about radios. You need to hear and need to be heard. I used to use TS2000 for many years, poo-pooed by a lot of people, but actually I think it's very good for digital modes because it doesn't have crystal filters in it. It has a very flat DSP type response. These days I use an Elecraft K3 and a G4 DDK transverter. For digital modes I use a wide filter rather than an SSB filter to keep the filter flat because you're not often worried about adjacent channel QRM on 2 meters for digital modes. A lot of people say, well, a second-hand PC or the wife's old PC is what I use. It doesn't really work very well for modern digital modes. You really need a multi-core processor with some grunt behind it. Particularly if you operate MSK144, if you have fairly low CPU grunt, you will actually be decoding probably 10, 20 seconds from when the signals are arriving. And Q65, the newer mode that's used by some on EME, especially on other bands, also needs a lot of horsepower in the PC. I actually use a 4-core PC, but it's also important to have a good sound card with a nice flat response to feed into it. In terms of software, use WSJTX if you want the latest bells and whistles and rig control. My way I term it is it's very nice for appliance operators, right? A lot of European DXs prefer MSHV from LZ2HV. The WSJT purists say, they've tweaked all of the threshold parameters, so you can't guarantee that it doesn't give false decodes. And people go funny about false decodes. But if you're a DXer, you know what is a false decode and what isn't. You really do. In over 10,000 EME QSOs in 1 year, I think I had 5 false decodes, and they were all random, none of which had my call sign in. So it's courses for courses. MSHV also has FSK 441 and some of the 6-meter popular modes in it that WSJTX doesn't, because Joe Taylor's team think that they are now passé and not the current vogue. Okay, the antenna is at absolute heart of your station. The pattern is far more important than the absolute gain. And these days, good front to back and side loads are essential in today's noisy environment. Tight patterns might not suit contesting, actually, because you only hear what you're pointing at if the aerial is perfectly good. But we're not concerned with contesting. I'm after working DX. And my maxim is especially with the high noise levels in all sorts of directions these days, you're unlikely to lose a QSO for 0.3 dB less gain, but you will lose a QSO for 3 dB more noise. And that is absolutely essential to work your way through that. Antenna height and low vertical angle are important, but only when it doesn't compromise your noise floor, as you'll see in a minute. Whoops. If you go to Digi7YBN's site, who's got the biggest compilation I know of and antenna data, unfortunately I pulled the wrong picture for my slide. This was for 4 Yagis, not 2, so the gain is rather large there. But actually, when you look at a whole big pile of commercial aerials, right, you're looking at less than 0.5 dB for the same difference in gain for the same boom length. So boom length is what counts, and you can go and have a look at tables on Digi7YBN's site. He's got most antennas there in the clutter, all right? So after a magnifying glass, incidentally, the aerial you'll see at the end of this is somewhere off the end of the scale up there, which is my current array. So really understand it's about signal over noise, and it's 3 dB more noise that's going to kill off what you work. Now, the fad is to model your aerials and all the rest of it. My personal favourite, for lots of reasons, is 4NEC2. It's free, it's available on QSL.net, and it's so powerful when used properly that together with Graham G4 DML, we designed a complete new set of 2 sets of aerials for 144 EME and built them and presented them earlier on this year at the EME conference. The other neat thing about 4NEC2, you can do near field pictures. This picture is 0 to 150 meters out from my 4 Yagi array at 16 meters above the ground. Unfortunately, with the way it plots, his ground is there. The purple color is 28 volts per meter, which is the EMF limit before you take modulation and things like that into consideration. So you do not want to have people in the purple area. But actually, at a distance out, it's almost never that I get above 12 volts, 12 or 13 volts per meter at distance. If you lower that array down, the software will show you that you can actually you can exceed the EMF limits at moderate distances. I think it's about there, which is about 40 or 50 meters from the base of the mast, that you run into problems. So learning to model your antenna is important, especially if you're going to build something that is not a stock one for GM3 SEK and the others models, and if you don't trust the Ofcom spreadsheet model to give an accurate result. So I've talked about takeoff really mattering. Coming back to the very basics, if you have an antenna there, you get a wave front that hits the ground at some distance away, and the argument is you get a reflected wave off the ground, so therefore you actually have a takeoff angle, and potentially you get some ground gain, potentially. So that's very simple, the way that that works, and it explains it all in the textbooks, and lots of people use it. The hard way of doing it is there is a spreadsheet tool on ON4KHG's site that allows you to calculate the first Fresnel ellipsoid underneath your aerials. Now this is my aerials at 18 meters above the ground, and you can see that actually I don't start to get ground reflection till about 110 metres out. In other words, beyond, just be at the limits of that near field plot I showed you. Then it goes out to over 3.5 kilometres. So you can imagine the way you're beaming, you're seeing everything on the ground as part of your antenna pattern in that ellipsoid. And that is very, very scary. I have a town at about 1.5 kilometres to 2.5 kilometres away. And as I raise the aerials, if I lower them and take them down to, I'm pretty sure that's 8 metres above the ground. So I've lowered the same aerial array. I move that ground reflection ellipsoid into being fairly close, 22 millimetres up to 3/4 kilometre. In fact, lowering my aerials in one direction can drop the noise floor by about 8 or 9 dB. But am I going to work more DX that way because I've raised my takeoff angle? If it's tropospheric ducting, perhaps, because that's always refracting and I'm close to the coast. But if it's ionospheric, if it is meteor scatter FIAI or sporadic E, I'm likely to work far less. So that you actually have a real difficulty in understanding where the vertical pattern of your aerial actually is. But there's worse to come. I told Mike Willis I was going to use a picture out of it. Mike Willis has done a really good set of online tutorials on radio propagation, more like the advanced course, right? When you start to look at the ground for these reflections off the ground, the real world is not flat. If you think about 144 megahertz, it's 2 meters. 1/8 of a wavelength is about 40 centimeters. No, it isn't. 25 centimeters or 10 inches, right? And you think a plowed field is going to be more than that. So to understand what's going on, you actually have to think about the ground reflection as being diffused. In other words, it's not a specular refraction, but is a complex and probably dominated by Rayleigh scattering. What that says is when you put your aerial system up, if you have a big patch in your first Fresnel zone, you're not going to get a nice, neat single lobe, but it's going to be a diffuse band over that. So these very nice patterns that people show you from antenna modeling of nice lobes in your vertical plane are probably all untrue, unless you've got a very close, small Fresnel zone and it's ultra-flat concrete or something like that. If it's real world, including ploughed fields, you end up with a diffuse front. And knowing your pattern and your noise floor is important. In the past, I used to do it with WSJT and manually say 10 degrees X and drop it into an Excel spreadsheet. I haven't done a noise plot because I couldn't find it on my PC, but G4HFQ has stopped updating it, but his software called Polar Plot is available on a number of mirror sites these days, and it is really good. You can do a noise plot to work out your background level. And to get your 0, you just need to put a 50 ohm load on your antenna, and you can work polar plot in timing. So if you time 0 round to 360 degrees on your rotator, and then just drop that into the program, have the program on the output of the sound card just pushing noise in, it works really well. Sorry I didn't have a plot, but I would really recommend Polar Plot. As an aside, that here is a picture of one of my new Yagis done on a test range at G4 DMLs. The back isn't quite symmetrical and smooth, because it was done with an aerial at only about 5 meters above the ground. And the back behind the test antenna was about 5 meters away, was a big 23 semi ME dish, and then behind that was another tower. So the front back isn't ideal, but Polar Plot gave us what we wanted for measuring aerials in the real world. Of course, you have to know about DXing possibilities. I would recommend every time that you should look every day and make more miles on VHF, the German site. If you don't use it already, that's the one that tells you what's up and coming, what modes it's going to be, and where they're going to be, so that you know whether to get up in the early hours of the morning to work EME, or a bit later in the early hours of the morning to work meteor scatter to work them. Really important. You know which mode to use, where to point, and the rest is down to luck and propagation. Internet chat is one of the real horrors. It's useful to find out who's on at a particular time, but other times, internet chat, whether it's terrestrial or EME, the sites are both listed there, can be a pain in the backside, because people are going, why haven't you heard me yet? Or, haven't you seen my call sign in the pile-up? And the guy at the DX end will go, I have over 30 stations calling. Please wait. And the other thing not to do, if you're running any form of schedule and the rest of it, is to say, oh, can you send the Rogers again? Or because that invalidates the QSO. If you send any QSO information during the QSO, internet chat is a nightmare for that. And you see so many people, and you think, oh, he's claimed to work this, that, and the other. Not true. I like tropospheric propagation. But actually, to get to grips with what the possibilities are for you, you need to use both Hepburn and F5LEN sites. And the reason for it is these two plots are done at they were taken at midnight before the 6 AM plot. And they actually show something quite different. So in East Anglia, Hepburn would suggest you've got a path down to northern Spain, IN51. My view is that if it is light green or yellow, or at best case red or purple, Hepburn is good. If it's light blue, probably not so much enhancement. However, F5LEN takes the refractive indexes in a subtly different way and heights to do his calculation. And actually, the path with F5LEN has petered out somewhere south of Dover. So up in East Anglia, I might have something, but it probably won't go down to northern Spain there. So understanding that it's still worth looking if it's on Hepburn, but understanding that there can be differences because the way the propagation predictions are made makes it important to look at both of them. Now, meteor scatter is great for DXing every day. It's really the bread and butter of working 1,200 to 2 and a bit thousand kilometers on 144 almost every day. But understanding what the common volume for the refraction is very, very important. There's an excellent set of articles by DJ5HG in Jubis magazine. Some of them are heavyweight, but they were in 5 parts, and they explain everything and when and how to operate. If your vertical takeoff angle is poor, it will tell you what you're unlikely to work. Because if your vertical takeoff angle, even with the clutter on the ground reflection giving a diffuse wavefront, is poor, you're unlikely to work. Say if you've got haven't got less than 3 degrees, you're unlikely to work more than 1,800, 1,900 kilometers by meteor scatter. Now the bit that will be very unpopular. MSK 144, which is popular because it's in WSJT-X, requires far longer, twice as long, and stronger bursts than FSK 441. It doesn't really matter on 50 megahertz because most bursts are quite strong and quite long. But if you're after really DXing, on 2 meters, you'll find that MSK rarely works beyond 2,000 kilometers because the bursts are short and they're generally very weak. And almost never on 432 megahertz meteor scatter, where FSK 441 still rules the day. Now, I know that's against popular usage, and the other thing that's hell on earth is the 144-360 MSK Tower of Babel, where you're unlikely to be able to work anybody because of the clutter and the replies anyway. So far better sit out on your own, call CQ, and give a working frequency on chat, as well as in your CQ. So understanding the simple view of meteor scatter is hard. If you look at the takeoff angle, hold on, I've got to go up to 3 degrees. Roughly less than 3 degrees, you need a takeoff angle for a QRB greater than 1,850 kilometers. And that's a two-way street. So that the other guy has to have a good takeoff angle as well. There was one square in the south of Italy where a de-expedition went, and I didn't hear a single ping from this guy, despite running quite high power and a big Yagi, well within my normal range. Over 2 days he was there. In the end, I had to work him on CWEME in desperation, right? Which was far easier. But understanding the refraction cone that you get from a meteor trail and how that intersects with the ground. If you look at this black area there, you'll see why for some of the longer ranges there's a very slight angular offset with the direct path. And that is because of the refraction, where the refraction cone from the ionized piece of the ionosphere where the meteor is burnt up causes this propagation and where it isn't exactly an even front on the ground. So, what tools do you need? For those of you that have done any meteor scatter, the absolute best tool you can use is Virgo. Virgo is a Java applet application that runs on a PC. You put in your locator and it shows you a list down there of the potential showers coming in, the radiant angle of that shower, and actually the rate. And the rate is quite important. So with a little bit of experience of using things like this, you can see what is the best direction. Now, this was taken at a time where there were more than one shower producing reflections. But actually, if you wanted to work northeast, southwest, it might not be the best time of day then, because you're going to get the worst reflections. So Virgo is a very, very simple tool. It's downloadable. All you have to do is enable Java to run on the host machine. The other thing that's quite important is, how do you know when reflections are good? There's all sorts of bullshit talked about on chat and the rest of it, and people go, there's no stones today and stuff like that, where you've got no idea which path they're pointing at. They might be opposite or in opposition to where one of the radiants is, so they're unlikely to get many reflections anyway. One of the things that's important is to understand that ionospheric disturbances do cause quite drastic differences in the number of radio reflections that you get from meteors. There is a very long URL there, which is a Finnish university, and you can see in the early hours of the morning that there's been some form of disturbance where the meteor rate has dropped right down. If that happens during the day, say when you want to operate or not, don't bother, because you know that the rate will be low, even though the Virgo predictions will be good because of planetary ionospheric disturbances. The good thing about the QVAT site is they actually have a long-term background that shows the time of day reflection rate that they get. So you can obviously see that the best time is probably about 6 in the morning, and middle afternoon, why can't I see that? Middle afternoon is probably the lowest rate on most days. So meter scatter tools are really, really good, and if you use the tools properly, you'll probably double your chances of working a given station by picking the right time of day or choosing when to work the expedition or whatever. 20 years ago, I couldn't have given a talk, when will sporadic E happen? One had to rely on Jim Bacon and his wet piece of Weatherman's string, suggesting that there might be thunderstorms in a particular area and the rest of it. Statistically, which is here, there's a time of day variation that I took from all of the events that were reported on Make More Miles at VHF that shows very clearly that on 144, it's not necessarily the same on 50 megahertz, at 144 you're more likely to get an event middle to late morning and from 5 to 6 local time in the evening. Those are the statistics. The wonderful thing was that G7RAU and others, Dave Edwards, worked out that you could effectively aggregate all sorts of DX spots from lower frequencies and the rest of it and work out a quasi-MUF, it's not a true MUF, for the reflection. This has been taken to town by people like Gabrielle at EA6VQ who runs DX maps. So if you actually have a look at this one, it shows that the reflection points for 144 were in this area here. If you want to be on at the early beginnings of an event, if you actually have that running in a window on your PC, and you see this quasi-MUF get to about 120, 130 megahertz, you know that is the time to warm up the linear. You know exactly where to beam, which is the central point where the MUF has come up, and the odds are that you will get on right at the beginning of the event where you will work further than when the MUF has risen right up. At the beginning and the end of events, the sporadically being refraction over a distance rather than reflection, you get the greatest ranges quite often. And of course, after the event, you can have a look at the reports. On this particular event, I was lazy, and I left my receiver on while I was doing something else, believe it or not, pointing into sort of southern Switzerland or whatever. And so PSK reported everything that my station heard on FT8. And it's quite surprising because I wouldn't have thought that I would have heard or been able to work some of these easterly stations. And in the end, I worked an Algerian on SSB anyway. Once I saw that come up on the screen, I switched the other transceiver. I switched my main transceiver on and called CQ and SSB. But also after the event, to understand who'd been working what. The analysis on Make More Miles at VHF is also very, very good because it shows who worked what at what time. So that if you've been looking and understanding your predictions, even if it didn't happen for you, it might have happened for somebody else, and that increases your knowledge and the way that you can use the prediction tools. Aurora forecast, there's a number of aurora forecasting sites. I've chosen one here, which is I think the Norwegian one. They all show the NOAA American forecast. So they show the auroral oval around the Earth and the time. One of the things to understand is for auroral propagation, you actually have to beam up somewhere, hit the auroral curtain, and you will get a field-aligned refraction stroke reflection back down to somewhere on Earth. And understanding if somebody says Kp equals 4, you realize the aurora is only going to come down to about that level, so that if you're more than 800 kilometers from that point on the surface of the Earth, your signal is unlikely to hit the auroral belt. Very unlikely. If Kp equals 6, then it's coming down somewhere over northern England, Scotland, and all possibilities are open. Really very, very good. So where should you be, what can you work and where should you be beaming? Lots of people, especially when I started 50, oh, you beam north. Do you? Is that the best way? There is a really good tool for almost every form of ionospheric propagation, which is called Beam Finder from DF5AI. It's a very simple Windows executable. Again, I couldn't find my own picture, so I had to nick one from his website, which is centered on JO22. So if you can imagine, go 2 squares west for it for me. Because of the way that aurora propagation works, where it is effectively scattering in a field-aligned type mode, depending on where the Earth's magnetic field is at the point, you have a set of possibilities. The green ones there are possibilities of refraction points. The blue stuff down here is what you can work. When you actually split it down, if you actually have a look from the 2 squares, you can work down almost to the east. And when you work down to the east, you will work the stuff furthest away to the southeast. And actually, working the furthest DX in the UK generally comes down to how far east you can beam rather than just beaming north. There are exceptions. You get exceptional auroral openings where you can work into OH, and it's almost beaming at it. So I'd almost say it's almost straight scattering. Signals are never super strong, but I've worked into OH and also as far as St. Petersburg like that. But to give you an idea of what you can work is Beam Finder software is very powerful and gives you better insight into the propagation. The one thing that there's no online tools for is field-aligned irregularities, or FAI, which is again a field-aligned thing. Believe it or not, if you use Beam Finder from DF5AI, you can see where the possible reflection points are, which is exactly the same for aurora. And so what you actually need is somewhere where you can hit with your antenna, remembering unless you're using elevation. So it will be in this area, so that you can use live MUF to start to look as when the MUF rises. Generally FAI occurs at the end of a sporadic E opening, but if the MUF has got very high, say to 120 megahertz or so, somewhere out to the east-northeast of you, which is rare for sporadic E because most of it is on a southerly heading, then there is a possibility of FAI. And on this occasion, there was some over the middle part of Denmark where you could work down to Middle Europe, HA and YU. So again, the online tools for live MUF do help if you've already looked at where you'll get reflections. The one where there's nothing at all is ionoscatter. You have to rely on chat to know when that's going to work, right? I don't know how to predict it. There's several varieties, mostly between May and September. But what I will say is the newer protocols from Joe Taylor and WSJT, Q65 works well, and if it's strong enough, CW. JT65 doesn't work because of the dispersion of the signal with the scintillation off the ionosphere. FT8 certainly doesn't work, although you might occasionally get random decodes, which is quite amusing. Richard, G4CDN, gave a talk 4 years ago at this convention on that. It's worth still looking back on YouTube to it. Combined propagation modes, Tim G4LOH gave a talk 2017. If you combine tropospheric and meteor scatter, for instance, you need to have a look at Hepburn and F5 LEN maps where your meteor is going to land and whether there's any ducts to carry it further. So it's quite a game. Tropo and E's common, Tropo and meteor scatter regularly exploited. I've worked Tropo plus Aurora. I didn't realise it to start with, but my signals were being ducted over the North Sea to the southern Norway coast, and I was working northern Sweden, which would be way beyond the sort of fence that you would expect to work by Aurora. And I'm told that Tropo and TEP has been observed on 144 between Japan and Australia. So when a lot of people work into EA8 on 144, you get the prognosis, oh, it's double hop sporadic E. Well, that's bollocks, it really is. Because if you look in most of these occasions, Hepburn's Tropo propagation map, you'll see between the Portuguese coast and down to EA8, there's this most ginormous subtropical duct. So really what's happening in this case between northern Holland and Germany is that some of them have got signals that just reach out into the sea and they're ducted to EA8. And I've seen cases of that, of dual mode propagation, all the way down to D4, so 5,000 kilometers. And it happens when, it will happen when you least expect it. So you need to keep an eye on live MUF to know where the opening is. And you also need to look at Hepburn and F5 LEN to see whether there's any other possibilities. Understanding the possibilities is where most people get the real edge and work the Super DX. This came out of a talk that I gave many years ago. You can work around 67 countries and over 600 squares via terrestrial modes on 144. You can work over 200 countries and 1,500 plus squares on EME. 144 EME is very active, 24 out of 28 days a month, almost whenever you can see the moon. With 100 watts and a 9 element, you can work a lot of people. With 400 watts and 2 9 elements, you can work many hundreds of very similar stations. Digital modes have changed the EME world, and none of the textbooks has really kept up. They used to say, oh, you need 500 watts a kilowatt and 4 Yagis. 100 watts and a 9 element, out of the back of a saloon car, I've worked something like 25 rare squares in the middle of the Australian outback for somebody that went mad enough with just his saloon car and an 8 element Yagi. 400 watts and 2 9 elements, you work hundreds of similar stations. With JT65 or Q65, that is about power. If you can work, you'd be able to work yourself, so you can work the masses of stations. If you have a kilowatt and 4x pol aerials, you can put yourself in the global top 50, and that's quite tough. I put my DXCC up earlier on. It was only serial number 133. It's now 340 plus on 144. When do you operate? Very, very easy tool on make more miles on VHF. The red curve shows the overall performance that comes from two parts: the background celestial noise behind the moon, the distance to the moon increases the attenuation, and depending on the position of the moon and its relative speed to the Earth, the libration changes, which will be is selective fading. The simple thing is that if you look at this and says this month, well, the first couple of days were not good. Most of that's fine. That there represents, hold on, I haven't got my own glasses on, so I can't see it. It represents about 3 or 4 dB increase in these, or decrease in the signal to noise, so that most of that area in there is workable for EME. Although if you've got 100 watts and a 9 element, the peak in the middle might make it a bit tough. Lots of people just come on and say, I want to work EME, and you might be there where the sky temperature is 3,000 or 4,000 degrees Kelvin, and it ain't going to happen. I'm not going to go into great detail, but yeah, I know. I can see. Oh yes, I am. I'm not going to go into great detail. VK3UM's station optimization tool, absolutely brilliant. Unfortunately, silent key, but it's still downloadable. It's a beautiful executable that allows you to plug and play with all your coax lengths, everything, and the losses in your station. What it takes is something like that these days. That's my most recent array. It's 4 times 5.5 wavelength. Each of them is cross-polarized. And Joe Taylor's come up with MAP65 software, which I think is revolutionary, because it takes a section of the band from your SDR and decodes all the digital signals in it. If you had software like this for FT8, you wouldn't have towers of Babel sitting there, and life would be much easier. On EME, you can spread out over 50 kilohertz and decodes all the stations. If you haven't got that, it's available online. livecq.eu. You can call CQ and see whether you can be heard by anybody, even without having a QSO, just like PSK Reporter. What I've done is I've got 2 slides here with all of the websites and where to download the software. It's just been a snapshot, really, that I've given you, but I've given you an introduction to the sort of tools and software that I use. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take 2 or 3 questions. Any vital questions? Although there's enough there to...
John, Q65 versus JT65. Question.
I've got it. JT65 versus Q65. It very much comes down to the ergonomics. The reason that Joe Taylor and his team are a bit fanatical is they claim Q65 does not need a lookup table. In other words, a call 3.text lookup table. However, once you've entered a call sign into the to the DX or who's working or heard somebody and clicked on it, it has a correlation table with 1 call sign and locator in it. So there's a bit of a misnomer there. I actually prefer JT65, and the reason being is it's only 48 seconds transmit, and you have 10 seconds for the operator to decide who they're going to work or try multiple decodes. The disadvantage, in Joe Taylor and his team's mind, is it cannot be made automated because it doesn't have the parity checks. So it depends what sort of DXer you are.
Any more? Okay. John, thank you very much. As expected, that was very detailed, loads of references. You will be able to see this presentation online in a few days' time. No, not in a few. Well, it depends, yes. They'll be spread out. But if in doubt, you can always email John and ask him questions.
My email address is on the RSGB site as VHF Manager. Just click a box and it sends me some spam, all right?